Good morning, everybody. Welcome again, and thank you for joining us for today. Our webinar today is on Terraform 0.15, and we are taking the first look at our official launch of this product with our community. So thank you guys for being part of this experience with us. Our team is definitely excited to share with you what we have. Joining us today will be Petros Kolyvas. He is the product manager for Terraform at HashiCorp. We also have Kyle Ruddy, who sits on our product marketing manager team. So Petros will begin with a presentation on what's new in Terraform 0.15, a lot of which lays the groundwork and the foundation for 1.0, so we're very excited about that. And then we'll turn it over to Kyle for an actual demonstration and a technical walkthrough of what we can expect in terms of new features and all of the exciting new things in the platform. Just a few housekeeping items before we officially move forward. First, we will be disseminating a recorded version of this event afterwards. That generally takes about 2 to 3 days, so we thank you for your patience in advance to allow for some post-processing time. But we will be sending out an email to everyone who's registered, and so you will be able to access this event on demand. The second thing is that we will be taking some time at the end to just address some community questions. So feel free to drop them in the chat box, and Petros will be leading that session. Hopefully we'll be responding to things that has benefit for the audience and the entire viewership as a whole. So looking forward to you hanging out with us throughout the end. Without further ado, I will turn it over to Petros to get us started on Terraform 0.15. And thank you guys again.
Thanks, Kitty. Indeed, my name is Petros Kolyvas, and I'm the product manager of Terraform Open Source here at HashiCorp. So why don't we just dive right in and get started? So Terraform 0.15 really is about us laying the foundation for a stable 1.0 version of Terraform. And so I think the theme you'll see throughout today's presentation and webinar is really one where we are trying to ensure that at the highest level, the things about Terraform that are stable are brought to as many workflows as possible, even where you might not be able to adopt 0.15 or 1.0 immediately. And so the first of those deliverables is increasing the local state file compatibility. And so if you have paid attention to Terraform 0.14 releases, you might have noticed that this feature, which was part of our 0.15 development cycle, was actually backported during our rundown to Terraform 0.14's release. And what that really means for you, the practitioner, or organizations that are dependent on Terraform is that Terraform state file is forwards compatible from 0.14 all the way to 1.0. We can't guarantee that it'll be compatible beyond that because new features may require state file changes, but for these three releases, 0.15, 0.14, and moving forward to a future release, you can interchange state files without worry. And that means point releases as well. You won't be stuck, with a forced upgrade or inability to downgrade. And we're really hopeful this is one of the major motions to Terraform being stable. By the same token, and perhaps more interestingly, are a set of changes where we have relaxed the remote state data source parser in Terraform such that we could broaden that compatibility even further. So if you use configurations that consume outputs from remote state, we backported a set of features from the 0.15 development work into 0.14, 0.13, and even all the way back to a 0.12 release. And again, our goal there was to make sure that you, the practitioner, the small team in the large organization are equally able to adopt Terraform 0.15 and ideally Terraform 1.0 as quickly as possible. And part of giving you the ability to do so means not forcing you to upgrade infrequently used configurations or state files that are exposing resources in a previous version of Terraform. And again, we are really excited about the ability of getting you to 1.0 as quickly as it's available. And so we're really happy to be sort of bringing some of this work into previous versions. So update to 12.30, update to 0.13.6, and you get a relaxed remote state data source as well. The other thing we did in 0.15 is unify the way Terraform CLI output is displayed. And that means that 0.15 has a single UTF-8 virtual terminal sequence compatible console output. Previous to 0.15, we were limited a little bit by the Windows legacy console API, and that meant we couldn't do some more interesting things on the terminal, on the command line for you, the practitioner, and we were hampered a little bit by that. So Microsoft had been advocating for a move to virtual terminal sequences for some time, and we made the jump here. And that means if you're running an up-to-date Windows 10 build, you will have native support for the same Terraform interface that users on macOS and Linux and FreeBSD have been used to for a little while, with the enhancement now of full UTF-8, so Unicode support. If you're stuck on a version of Windows because of your organization, like Windows 8 or a early release of Windows 10, there are still options for you. This doesn't shut the door on your ability to use Terraform. You can use a third-party terminal emulator or console tool, and you too will be able to take advantage of this. And I think this work is largely foundational for moving Terraform forward, rather than being delivered with a bunch of flashy bells and whistles in the console today. The other big change we're bringing to Terraform 0.15, and it's sort of an evolution of some of the work that we started in 0.14, is graduating provider attribute sensitivity to production. So while in 0.14 we shipped sensitive input variable values, and so the ability to mark input variables as sensitive and have those values redacted throughout your Terraform plan in the console output, the behavior to use provider attributes which were marked sensitive by the providers themselves was experimental. And so if you're not familiar with what I'm talking about here, one of the most concrete examples I can give you is that the AWS DB instance resource would, by default, starting in 0.12, mark the password attribute as sensitive and redact that value. But that sensitivity wouldn't propagate throughout the plan. So starting in Terraform 0.15, it does. And that means you can refer to values and have them redacted elsewhere without, additional work or worry. We've also created a sensitive function. And I just want to make sure that my screen is being shared here. Yes. We're going to pause for a second. Yeah.
I did want to share it really briefly in case anybody's having any viewership problems. Everything is being shared live via the media player. There might not be anything to view in the slide section, but you should be able to see the screen share in the media player. And if you have no audio, there's a little volume icon on the bottom, and sometimes it's automatically on mute, so you can just increase that volume. Thank you.
Thanks, Kitty. And yeah, if there are any technical issues or you can't see something, speak up. Kitty will get my attention again, and we can kind of figure out how to share this info. So building off provider sensitivity and provider attribute sensitivity, rather, we've also introduced a sensitive and non-sensitive function into Terraform 0.15. And again, I think it's worth kind of going back to the initial work in Terraform 0.14, where the goal of Terraform's kind of notion of sensitivity is really to empower practitioners to protect values from inadvertent egress. This really isn't about encrypting values in your state file, but rather just making sure that values aren't printed to the screen, so that if some other system, like system logging or some kind of, egress of that data into, let's say, Git or GitHub or GitLab, whatever, doesn't expose you and your organization to values you want to keep private, by making them public. Anyway, so we've also introduced a sensitive function, and this allows you to even more create a more targeted version of the behavior specific to your use cases. So on the slide you're looking at here, you could see that if you had an instance with a password, you could ideally where you were retrieving, that password from a data source, maybe some kind of, I don't know, vault type thing. I think that's a tool people use. I hear it's sort of popular. But if you're trying to retrieve a value via data source, you could mark that value sensitive, and that sensitivity will also propagate throughout your Terraform plan. There's equally a non-sensitive function, and that would be if you're using more complex type variables and Terraform starts behaving in a way where the sensitive behavior is preventing you from achieving your goals. You can use the non-sensitive function to unmark those values and, kind of move along home. And we're hopeful that this helps sort of give you, the user, the practitioner, the most flexible version of this behavior while still protecting organizations and teams from accidental value egress. The other big change in Terraform 0.15, which is really in the end a minor one that should have, impacts on your workflow, is that we have introduced a new configuration alias argument to the required providers section of your configuration within modules. And really, this is about defining your provider aliases in the context of the required providers block, giving you the advantage of sort of collating all the module-specific provider names into a single location within a module. And so really this is about clarity for modular workflows, teams that are creating modules for other teams, teams that are consuming modules, knowing what aliases are expected and where to find them is really, really helpful for kind of making Terraform easier to use at scale. And additionally, this means you don't need to use empty provider blocks in modules now. And we're really hopeful this will help clean up a lot of the ambiguity that existed around namespace providers when we introduced that feature in 0.13 and how it affected some users throughout the upgrade cycle following that. The other big change in Terraform 0.15 is one that we aren't likely to see the effects of for a little while, and that's structured log levels. So if you've had to debug Terraform in the past, or you're a provider developer who occasionally needs to see Terraform's debug logs, or frequently, whatever it might be, there was really only one option, and that was turning on the trace log level. And that is far from ideal. So moving forward, providers that are built against recent versions of the SDK can target discrete log levels and can do so independently of Terraform core. So, I think it's going to take a little while for providers out in the ecosystem to start adopting this type of behavior, but we should see a much more robust ability to debug Terraform in those trying situations when you need it to work and you're not sure why, than you can do today, when you have to kind of pour through a number of annoying and sort of relatively unhelpful log messages. Because Terraform 0.15 really is about us making motions to Terraform 1.0, there are a number of removals and changes that are worth taking note of. The biggest one is actually AD deprecation. A lot of customers, a lot of practitioners, and a lot of organizations are quite happy with a pattern where a file filled with variable values is not sort of consumed in its entirety by a Terraform configuration. You might just consume, or in your configuration declare a subset of those variables, but your variable set expands beyond the given configuration. And Terraform had been warning you that we would remove this behavior and that you should be adopting environment variables instead. And we have decided that that was the wrong approach and that we will support undeclared variable use for the foreseeable future. There is no plan to deprecate it, no plan to remove it. We do still want customers, users, practitioners to heed the warnings that, that the warning that was introduced in Terraform 0.12 was largely about helping you understand that you might have made a simple spelling mistake, that your configuration calls for one variable and that your value file defines another, and sort of giving you the opportunity to rectify that potential issue. But because the workflow is also used for many other reasons, we are continuing to support it. So warnings are still there. There are some options to reduce them if they're filling up your console or your logs. But ideally, this is the sort of balanced, measured path forward where we heard the community, we've put the feature back, and we're going to support it for long term. There are some other removals. The Atlas backend, so the original Terraform Enterprise backend, has been removed. Vendored provisioners have been removed from the code base. So that means that while you absolutely can still use remote exec, local exec, and the file provisioners, Puppet, Saltmasterless, Chef, and Habitat, the community contributed third-party provisioners, have been removed. A deprecation cycle we started in 0.13. And that means that if you would like to replicate that behavior, we have a migration guide, and it's still relatively straightforward to do with the existing provisioner set, but we don't intend to support tool-specific provisioners for the foreseeable future. And I think there is some discussion going on in the community that's worth following about whether, providers might be an option now, since provisioners were a sort of something that came out of early Terraform, and then tool-specific ones were built on those. And that's a discussion we're more than willing to have with the community moving forward. The list and map functions have been replaced. So they were deprecated when 0.12 came out with more strongly typed variables, and those have been replaced if you need them with toList and toMap, and hopefully there's been enough time between that your configuration won't be stuck in the middle with any of these. And I think, kind of the end of 0.15 or the end of the 0.15 development cycle has seen a lot of practitioners using and wanting to use Apple Silicon in their workflows. And while 0.15 isn't launching with Darwin ARM64 support, you will see it beginning to appear in the 0.15 lifecycle. And I think it's worth explaining why it's not such an easy problem for Terraform. Largely, we can't ship a version of the Terraform CLI tool if providers for that same platform or architecture aren't available. You would go to do Terraform init, and it would tell you there are no providers available. And we've seen a lot of strange behavior trying to run Terraform in x86 emulation or x64 emulation on the Darwin platform. So we are beginning to roll out more and more providers. Our ecosystem is beginning to adopt a Darwin ARM64 build pipeline or build pipelines, and then you'll begin to see Terraform adopt it once at least our official providers are available. So stay tuned. We know that everyone is excited to have this hardware, or some of you are, and we will support it as soon as we can. And I think that it is now time for me to hand this over to Kyle to do some actual demos.
Awesome. Thank you very much for that, Petros. There are a lot of exciting improvements coming with Terraform 0.15, and I have the great pleasure of being able to walk us through some of the usage of some of these improvements and updates. So let me get my screen share set up here. Petros, if you can, or Kitty, if either one of you could let me know when we see the demo time slide pop up.
We should be all good.
Okay, fantastic. All right. So let's dive in first with some of the updates that go in between the two different versions. So what we have on my screen right here is a Terraform 0.14 session that's set up with PowerShell here. That's just we're running that as our shell of choice. So let's go ahead and run a Terraform apply, and let's just create something kind of basic. Random provider is one of my favorites. Actually, let's see. It looks like I have some remnants sticking out here. Let me drop those off. All right, so let's start this again. 0.14, start from our Terraform apply. We're going to create a just randomized pet for this, something that's easy to show off, something that's local. We're going to make use of some of these improvements that have been coming through, 0.13 and 0.14. So we're adding some sensitivity in here to kind of hide or obfuscate that from the output. And then here down at the bottom, we have our newly created animal. It's just my username, open, and corgi. Love the randomized stuff because you never know what you're going to get. All right, so with that, we're going to switch over here and let's take a look at some warnings and how that output is kind of handled. So using some branches here on my repo, we're going to switch over to our warning branch, and we're going to do another Terraform plan. So here what we've done is we've added a tf-vars file, and we've also created another resource block, this time called client. So we have our warn me variable that's up here. We get our nice little message saying that this is deprecated and will eventually go away in the future. And then we also have we have not created a client block for our new resource there. So let's take a little bit of a look at this over on Terraform 0.15. We're doing another version check here. I want you to see that we are using the same thing, 0.15 on that side, and we're going to do another Terraform plan. So kind of putting these side by side, we can see, this is part of the improvements to the UTF-8 output. So on the left-hand side, that's our 0.14, right side, 0.15. You can see some of the nice additions here showing us that, our warning is condensed within this particular block. We can also see that it no longer says that it's deprecated. It has that updates. And we can also go through and change this so that we can, no longer show warnings when we're using TF-vars and undeclared variables. Cool little feature there for those. And then down here at the bottom, we can see our error output. So we have our reference to our undeclared input variable for that. And then we can still see some of those, nice UTF-8 formatted condensed sections of, allowing you to line up what error lines up to which code and so forth. And it's a little easier to read as well. You can see a little bit of a difference in the formatting of the text. So pretty nice from that aspect. So going back to our 0.14, we're going to take a look at how some of the sensitivity works now. So we're going to switch over to a different branch and clear out of that. And then we're going to run a Terraform apply. So here now we've added a new item to this configuration. So we're going to be creating a randomized password because we're trying to take a look at how Terraform 0.14 versus 0.15 handles those sensitive, the output, the arguments, and so forth. So on the left-hand side, we're going to create that randomized password. Down here towards the bottom, you can see that we still have our open corgi as our animal, but we have our password. Now, one of the big issues there is that we can actually see the password, like that's plain text output to our screen here. So if we go back over to our Terraform 0.15 side, we'll do another Terraform apply. Oops, helps if I spell it correctly. Doing our apply there, instead of seeing that plain text output, we get an error telling us that one of those values that we've marked for output is marked as sensitive. So it's not going to output that information, and it actually gives us an error. So we can update that and change the way that works within Terraform by updating our outputs file. But instead of that, we're going to switch branches again, and I'll show you the update that I'm making there. Oops, hit switch. So if we run through our Terraform apply again, no warning, so much better. If we say yes, we can also see our outputs have been updated. Now, this is another one of those changes to the UTF-8 configuration here. So on the right-hand side, again, we see some different changes to the way that our text is formatted and how it's broken out. We can see that our animal is still that open corgi. However, our password is now marked as sensitive. So no longer are we taking those items that are marked as sensitive within our configuration and outputting them in plain text. And we can kind of show, it's a very basic update to our configuration here. So our outputs, it's just adding that sensitive Boolean of marking it as true. All right, so now one last thing that I kind of want to show off here is updating to use our these marking things as sensitive that maybe weren't already marked as sensitive. So having a little more control over our configuration there and what's shown or what's redacted. So let's do another switch of our repository here over to a non-sensitive. We're going to now be adding a new output to our file here. So we can still see our password that's marked as sensitive of true. And then we have our unsecure password output. And we're using that non-sensitive item that Petros was just talking about to take our sensitive password and unredact it so that we can show it, if we were going through the process of actually needing to do that. This also works the same way. So if it was something that was not sensitive, we can just say sensitive and then reference that within our outputs or even with our configuration file itself. So instead of this time, we're just going to go ahead and hit it with an auto approve. So now we can see we still have our open corgi, we still have our password that's marked as sensitive, and we can now see that our unsecured password is matching up to what we have on the left-hand side with our 0.14 code. So really kind of cool of a way to see some of the updates in the way that Terraform handles console output and how Terraform is interacting with some of those attributes or resources that might or might not need to be marked as sensitive. So for our next demo, I kind of want to show some of the interoperability between the different versions of Terraform itself. So we're going to be making use of Terraform Cloud because that's just a really easy way to switch between versions in a fairly easy, ready to go fashion. So what we have here is a demo, a web page that's set up as a HashiCats version. It's just a very simplistic web page that's set up and run through Azure. We have this also for GCP and AWS, but Azure is the chosen one for today. Taking a look at our first workspace here, this is just creating our resource group within Azure. We can see over here, this is our new Workspace Overview page. This was brand new, released just a couple weeks ago. In this case, we can see that we're using Terraform version 0.15 to create one resource, which is going to be our resource group. And then we even have some output. Our output here is very important because we're going to be seeing that here in a second. So from that point, we also then need to create some security policies and networking configuration so that we can reach this particular web service. So in this one, we're using Terraform version 0.13.6. And with this, we're creating 6 different resources. And again, we have some very important output that's down here. So we're actually going to copy that because I'll show you, just as a verification, the web server is out there, but it's not configured. So I did a lot of the heavy lifting beforehand because, I don't want to fill our demo here with dead space. So with this, we are going to transition back over to our next workspace, which is the creation of a virtual machine where this web server is currently running. In this case, we're using Terraform version 0.14.9. We've created 5 different resources as part of that. And then we've created some outputs down here for our credentials, which is, we're going to use a remote exec to log into this system and run some things that creates our web server in our web page. And then we have the output of a VM name. That too is going to be important because we're going to import all of these outputs to do some things to create that web server. So for our last workspace here, we're going to go all the way back to 0.12 and use actually 0.12.30 to go ahead and actually spin up and create this web server that we want to see. So we can just spin it up. We're going to queue it manually. So just running our plan and apply directly from the Terraform Cloud Console. While that's running, show you a couple other things that are kind of cool and important. This is a version control based setup and workflow for Terraform. So it also can now start importing things such as a README, so you can know, kind of what's going on behind here. This is just a static web application that we're being deployed, some of the prereqs, all things that are included in the README. Really cool, kind of adds to some nicety of understanding what's happening. We can also see, who has access to all this stuff through our contributors. So in this case, our Azure team. All right, so looks like our run has completed. We can see that it's ran, it's been applied, and it's passed all of its policy as code, our Sentinel policy checks. So if we go back to our Ubuntu web page here, we should see that we now have a cat image, just a randomized cat image being pulled from a separate site. And then we can see that we have a greetings from Terraform 0.12. And we can see that not only have we fed and pulled some of that information from those outputs, but we're also injecting them into this web page that was just created and spun out. So we can see our resource group name is kmruddy-demo. Our FQDN matches up to the page or the site that we're on right now. And we also have our VM name. Now, just to prove to you that there's no, this isn't smoke and mirrors, if we go back to our workspace here, we can click on variables, and we have no variables configured whatsoever. So, it's the only source of information that it has are through that remote state data sources. So really kind of a cool way to kind of show how Terraform can help you, still while you're working through the process of upgrading to different versions, you can still have that interoperability between the different versions. So you're not rushed or pushed directly into upgrading to the latest and greatest version without being able to, turn back. So with that, let's go back to our slides here. And so we have some additional resources as well for you to follow up and check in on. 0.15 is already available. We did release it last week. So that is available for download now through your package manager of choice or directly through the HashiCorp Terraform download site. We have a fantastic GA announcement blog that was created by Petros and our engineering team and shared out on the HashiCorp blogs. We have an upgrade guide for you to read through and consider. There's not a whole lot of, actually, there's no real breaking changes or things that you need to worry about with this, but there are some things to consider as you move through the versions. So keep that in mind. Then we also have a brand new Learn guide that's out there. So HashiCorp Learn is a fantastic resource as you're kind of continuing through and learning about different parts and portions of Terraform and how it's used. In this case, it's a new troubleshooting guide specifically for Terraform. It's a walkthrough, so it kind of guides you through the process of, in this case, troubleshooting some things. So great resource there. All of these links will be available after the webinar, and they'll be sent through your email. So with that, I think it's time to start running through some questions. I know there were some really great questions that I was seeing as I was watching Petros present earlier. So
you have kindly collected those questions for me, and I will tackle them one at a time. How's this? So the first one is a mea culpa. Michael asked, so are you saying that if we standardize on 0.15, there is no guarantee that our work will be compatible for 1.0? And I think that's my fault. If that was what you got, I'm really sorry. What I'm actually saying is that if you're using 0.15, 1.0 should just be drop-in. In fact, I think that's the case largely for 0.14 workflows as well. But as usual, we do recommend you try to run a no-op on interim versions. So 0.14, 0.15, 1.0, broadly cross-compatible. There should be no breaking changes at all in this workflow. And I'm sorry, again, if I gave you the impression of anything but the contrary, to the contrary. Fred Small asked, is sensitivity how you achieve redaction? And again, I think that is me perhaps assuming a little too much of like a priori knowledge of 0.14. Indeed, when I use the word sensitivity, what I'm talking about and what we're talking about broadly in Terraform is that a value that is marked as sensitive will show up in a plan output as redacted. It's sort of usually like a set of braces and then sensitive. And that's what I'm talking about, redaction and sensitivity. Redaction is what happens in the output for values marked sensitive if they're working properly. So I hope that's clear. If it's not, ask me another question and I will come back at it. Kyler Middleton, who I've had actually the great pleasure of meeting in person, asked, logging in provider versus core, can it be targeted against a specific provider? Sadly not. Right now it is either core or provider feedback. And I think largely the use case we were thinking of was provider development more than debugging. So ideally, you're working with a configuration with one provider here. But I do think that's, totally valid feature request. I can already see some of the use cases where you're trying to debug a more complex deploy, where even with provider developers, you're trying to develop, let's say, something in a Kubernetes workflow where almost kind of out of the box, you need 7 or 8 providers for a typical deployment plan. So yeah, hit us up with that feature request. It's a great question. Not in 0.15 is the short answer. Another one from Kyler. Will Terraform still warn when a variable is undeclared, or will this be silenced by default? So in 0.13, I believe, don't quote me on this, we introduced a feature where the warning is limited, or a single warning, so a warning of the same type is limited to 3 instances before they're silenced. So, if you're seeing an undeclared variable value warning, even in the worst case, it should only show up 3 times. So you could use 1,000 variables. Still see it 3 times. However, if that's still too annoying, there is a compact warnings command line argument that can be used to further slim them down. So, it would go from 13 or 14 lines to just 3. And that is sort of the middle ground that we've settled on. We don't want them silenced completely. We do want users to still know they're there, practitioners to know that they're there. And I think this is the trade-off that we as the Terraform team have felt strikes the right balance. We've got a hot button topic here for the next one. Akash is asking, I hope I pronounced that correctly, how will we bring Terraform and Ansible, I think, together without third-party provisioners? And that's a really good question. I think what I would offer instead of answering this question directly, and now I'm putting on my product manager dancing shoes, is we're recommending some alternative workflows for most users, at least for consideration, and that would be to consider using something like Cloud Init, or there's this really cool HashiCorp tool called Packer. Sorry, I kid. But a Packer workflow where you can provision those instances, those machine images before you get to Terraform. Now, I realize that's not ideal for everyone, but we're trying to strike a balance between sort of the vision for Terraform here and the maintainability of those instances. Particularly, there are a lot of issues with Terraform configurations where provisioned, and not in the Terraform sense, but in the provisioner sense, instances or resources struggle to be destroyed properly or changed. And we wanted to make sure that a stable version of Terraform could support the core workflows for as long as possible. So we recommend that users give Cloud Init and Packer some really strong consideration before they decide that sort of ad hoc provisioning of resources is the way to go. But again, this is an open source tool, and so we are always listening to our community. If our decisions are not ideal or you want to have a discussion about them, we are here to talk to you. And I think with undeclared variable values, we're willing to reconsider when, it warrants it. Here's one from Olivier, and I'm not sure if I understand it. Have you made it easier to view hidden values? When I run a plan, it's nice to see only the changes, but there are times I want to see the hidden values. What I think this question is asking is about our concise diff, so please correct me if I'm wrong. And basically, depending on how new to Terraform you are or not, Terraform 0.12 got very verbose in its plan output, and it would show you all the attributes of a resource, whether they were being changed or not. And so in 0.13, I think, or 0.14 now, I can't remember. Shame on me. We introduced concise diff, which only showed the values which were changing. And originally, there was an experimental command line argument that would allow you to use the original fully detailed plan output instead of just the values that are changing. And that has gone away. I think he's saying the flag makes that work seem hard to find. And I think, again, this is sort of like that question Kyler asked, and now we're kind of peering into how we think about changes to our product, where we're trying to strike a balance between flexibility, usability, and really sane defaults. And one of the features that is available for concise diff is for the provider developers to override some of the diffing mechanism so that when values that aren't changing are still critically important for practitioners to see, they can be displayed by Terraform. And that's a conversation we recommend you engage with the teams that are producing the providers you're using. I definitely can see a use case. We've seen a number of use cases where some of the values that were hidden were important, and I think we're aware of it. We still would like to encourage the concise diff as the default method because it's just very difficult to consume all those values in a very long plan. And I think there is a way out if today you absolutely need to see all the values out of a plan. We recommend generating a plan file and then parsing it into JSON via Terraform so that you can evaluate that for yourself. It's not quite as elegant, certainly, for those who need it, but there are workarounds at least. And I hope that was helpful. The next one is the hottest button topic of them all. Is there a time frame for Terraform 1.0? Literally the question I've been getting ever since I joined. And I think there is, and we are going to be a little more coy about it. I can say that you should definitely pay attention to the Terraform space over the next couple of months. And sort of going back to the first Q&A question, like I said, 0.15 work should drop right into 1.0 workflows, and that should tell you a little bit about how close we are, as I kind of still avoid this question directly. I mean, the team is definitely talking about a version of Terraform being promoted to 1.0, and so I'll leave that with you as like the last piece of the puzzle. Tarun is asking, why would you not use the sensitive function with the output password? And I'm not sure, I'm not actually sure about the context of the question, but if you meant with the data source example that I used, where I was wrapping a sort of a resource address from a data source in the sensitive function, I think that's a fair point, and that's something for future expansion of Terraform, where you might say that everything coming out of a given data source, so let's say that data source was Vault, for example, is sensitive, and you want it to be marked sensitive. It's just not where we are today. So that's going to be a feature request on our backlog. I do think that the sensitive function, though, allows you in the interim to target any value discreetly. Hopefully that helps. Daniel is asking, can you decode the sensitive values? Well, so again, it's probably worth noting that those aren't encoded. They're being redacted from the console. So, Terraform's interactive output will redact those values, but they're not encoded in any way. And so if by encoded you mean the mark that is redacting them, then yeah, the non-sensitive function would allow you to reveal those values in the console if you wanted. The function wasn't designed to reveal values, though. The non-sensitive function and the sensitive function were designed because in some cases Terraform will error. So if you try to use a value that is marked as sensitive, that Terraform expects to redact in some way in a resource that would expose it, or outside of or out of a module output, and you're not marking that output sensitive, Terraform will error to help you build a really coherent pattern in your configuration to maintain sensitivity. And so the function is really about getting around places where you as a practitioner might get stuck. You're like, Terraform is erroring here because it says this should be sensitive and I don't want it to be sensitive. That's what it's for. And it's really not encode decode. Bradley is asking, do you have a GitHub link to the example? Now, I think this might be related to the demo. So Kyle, do you know if any of this would be available?
Yeah, I guess it depends on which one, but I will get the both the sensitivity demo and the various branches, as well as the HashiCats demo up on my personal GitHub repository. So look out for that here, within a couple hours. Username KMRUDDY.
Cool. And I've got a really good question from Garrett here. He said that he thought he could read that Terraform 0.15 could upgrade between a state file from Terraform 0.11 all the way to 0.15 to make upgrading easier. And I'm not sure where you read that, but it's not possible. The state file format has certainly changed significantly between 0.11 and 0.12, and then again between 0.12 and 0.13. And then the final time was the introduction of sensitivity in 0.14. And so particularly for 0.11 to 0.12, there's still a significant upgrade workflow that needs to be undertaken to do that. And then after that, 0.12 to 0.13 is namespace providers, and then sensitivity. Now there is some wiggle room in there, but we definitely can't recommend upgrading from 0.11 or 0.12 directly to 0.15. That's just a little too far back in Terraform's maturity cycle, unfortunately. I wish it was different. Here's a question that I might not be able to answer. What is missing is the display of the provider versions that are effectively used to init a run. So you know what? I will actually bring this to our Terraform Cloud product team. I don't have any answers on those features here, but certainly an interesting one. I am parsing through the rest of the questions here as quickly as I can. I think we're getting close to time, though.
We can do one more if you'd like.
All right, I'm going to take another upgrade question to clarify some of the confusion I think I caused. And so here's a question that says, it sounded like if we are largely on 0.12.x that we could upgrade to 0.30 first, and then we could potentially upgrade to 0.15. So the answer to that, I believe, is unfortunately no. 0.14, 0.15, 1.0, very cross-compatible. The outputs from a remote state in 0.12.30 can be consumed by any version of Terraform. But if you're on 0.12 of any version, you really do need to get to 0.13. That's probably the closest possible target where you could potentially upgrade, but again, we don't advise that. So 0.12 HCL2 was introduced, 0.13 namespace providers and a more robust provider registry was introduced, and those two things require an actual upgrade tool that's included with those versions of Terraform. So I think it would really depend on the organization, the setup of their automation, and sort of Terraform infrastructure, but I wouldn't recommend that anyone ever try to upgrade from 12.30 to 0.15. You're going to run into provider namespace issues at the very minimum. So yeah, really could potentially consider 0.13, but I wouldn't recommend it. Get to 0.14 and then it's smooth sailing. And that's it for me.
Just want to say thank you so much to Petros and Kyle for all of the insights that they shared with us today. I think it's always a very rewarding and fulfilling experience to be able to engage with our community like this. So I know we greatly appreciate it, and thank you to everyone who joined us and shared their time with us today. Just to let you all know before we wrap up, because we did see some questions about this, so I'll address it to everyone. Again, we will be sharing an email with the recorded version of this event to everyone who signed up. That email will include the video. That email will also include all of the slides, and we'll also add in the links to the upgrade guide, the GitHub repository, anything that'll be a useful resource for the community. So just keep an eye out for that in the next 2 to 3 days, at most a week. But in the next 2 to 3 days, it should be made available. And we'll also have this video up on YouTube as well, so you can check out for it there. Thank you, guys. We apologize for not being able to answer every question, but as always, your feedback is appreciated. You can share them with us on Twitter or any of our other social media platforms. And with that, we will tell everyone to have a wonderful Wednesday and hope to see you again on the next Terraform event. Thank you all and goodbye.